In a city where the ocean breeze carried the scent of money and the heat pressed against glass towers like a confession waiting to be heard, Vera Diemer had learned to become furniture. Not invisible furniture was better than invisible. Invisible meant you were overlooked. Furniture meant you were trusted to be exactly where you were, doing exactly nothing important, while the world unfolded its secrets around you like a man loosening his tie after a long day. It was a skill she had sharpened over 14 months. 14 months of wiping conference tables that cost more than her rent. 14 months of refilling water pitchers with a pleasant, vacant expression that said, "I am no one. I understand nothing. I am harmless." 14 months of swallowing her own name and wearing a borrowed one, Grace Okafor, stitched together from a dead woman's birth certificate, and enough forged paperwork to pass a background check like a costume that itched in places no one could see. At 27, Vera Diemer, former investigative journalist, former daughter of a name that once meant something in this city, current ghost had perfected the architecture of a lie built from silence. She smiled when spoken to. She nodded when dismissed. She wore her crimson-red blouse like a uniform, the same silk button-down every Monday, pressed sharp enough to suggest she cared about her appearance but not enough to suggest she cared about anything else. The red was a private rebellion, a flame she carried against her chest because some part of her refused to dress in the gray that this building, this role, this slow suffocation demanded. Her natural hair was pulled into a thick, braided crown, pinned with the precision of someone who understood that looking put together was its own kind of camouflage, neat enough for corporate, elegant enough to deflect questions, ordinary enough to be forgotten the moment she left a room. This was the Meridian Atlantic Tower, 42 floors of tinted glass and imported marble, rising from the coastline of a tropical metropolis that had learned to smile with too many teeth. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, palm trees swayed against a sky so aggressively blue it looked manufactured. The roads below were veined with traffic motorcycles weaving between SUVs, street vendors selling roasted plantain beneath the indifferent shadow of a building where men in linen suits decided the futures of people who would never learn their names. It was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made you forget the thing you came here to find. And Vera had come to find a ledger. Not just any ledger. The black market accounting record that would prove CEO Charles Whitmore philanthropist, board member, magazine cover darling, had systematically destroyed her father's shipping company, absorbed its assets through a fraudulent acquisition, and used the resulting infrastructure to run one of the largest human trafficking pipelines on the West African coast. The kind of ledger that didn't exist on any server or in any cloud. It lived in a physical vault, 17 floors beneath her feet, locked behind biometric access and armed men who were paid enough to forget the sound of screaming. Her mother had died without seeing justice. Her father had died without clearing his name. The Diemer family legacy had been reduced to tabloid headlines and whispered scandal, and Vera had spent 3 years clawing her way from disgraced journalist to invisible assistant for one single purpose: to steal the proof that would burn Charles Whitmore's empire to the ground and scatter the ashes where the whole world could see. But tonight was supposed to be simple. A Thursday. The executive floor cleared out by 7. Vera was tidying the 41st floor boardroom, collecting forgotten coffee cups and aligning leather chairs around the obsidian conference table with the muscle memory of a woman who had done this 1,000 times. The city glittered through the windows behind her, the sunset bleeding tangerine and gold across the harbor, and for a brief, reckless moment, Vera allowed herself to feel almost safe. That was her first mistake. She heard them before she saw them. The stairwell door, not the elevator, never the elevator, because elevators kept logs swinging open with a hydraulic whisper. Footsteps. 3 sets. 2 heavy, deliberate, the footfalls of men trained to move with purpose. And 1 set lighter, almost silent, the kind of quiet that didn't come from carelessness but from a lifetime of entering rooms where noise meant death. Vera's hands froze on the back of a leather chair. Korean. They were speaking Korean. Rapid, clipped, the dialect of soul with an edge that came from money or violence or both. Vera's pulse spiked so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She understood every syllable, every single one. Because her mother god, rest her stubborn, beautiful, relentless mother, had spent the last 2 years of her life bedridden with lung disease in their small house on the edge of this city, refusing to speak anything but Edo and Pidgin to the nurses, but devouring Korean dramas like oxygen. The television was always on. Always. Subtitles scrolling across the screen while her mother whispered the dialogue along with the actors, memorizing phrases in a language no one else in the neighborhood spoke, building a private world inside a body that was failing her. And little Vera, 13 years old and desperate to keep her mother laughing, had learned Korean the way other children learned prayers, by repetition, by devotion, by love so fierce it carved new pathways in her brain. What started as mimicking drama dialogue became 3 semesters of formal study at the city's language institute. What started as a daughter's love became fluency so sharp she could distinguish regional accents, read business contracts, and catch the specific inflection a man used when he was lying. And right now, the man with the quiet footsteps was not lying. He was planning. The vault access rotates at midnight. We breach through the sub-level service corridor, the one Whitmore's security doesn't monitor because he uses it for the shipments. Jae-won, you handle the biometric override. Sung-min, I need eyes on every camera from the 38th floor down. If anyone moves, I need to know before they take their next breath. Vera's blood turned to ice water. She forced her hands to move, picked up a coffee cup, set it on her tray. She began humming a low, aimless melody, the kind a bored cleaning assistant might hum when she was thinking about dinner and bus schedules and nothing at all. Do not look up. Do not react. You are furniture. You are nobody. You do not understand a single word. She could see them now in her peripheral vision, 2 men in dark suits flanking a third. The 2 flanking figures were built like architecture, broad shoulders, watchful eyes, the coiled stillness of bodyguards who had stopped counting the number of rooms they'd cleared. But the man between them, the man who moved with that terrifying liquid silence, he was something else entirely. He wore a tailored black dress shirt, crisp and precise, with the sleeves rolled to his elbows in a way that should have looked casual but instead looked like a declaration. Because what the rolled sleeves revealed was ink, not the scattered, impulsive tattoos of a man who'd wandered into a parlor on a drunken night. These were deliberate, intricate. Swallows in flight across his right forearm, dark roses blooming over his knuckles. Geometric patterns, sharp, angular, almost architectural, crawling from his wrists up past his elbows and disappearing beneath the black fabric, reappearing at his collar where the ink traced the side of his neck like a map to somewhere you were not invited. Silver rings caught the dying sunlight on 3 of his fingers. His dark hair was swept back, controlled, not a strand out of place. And his face held the kind of stillness that only came from absolute certainty, not arrogance, something worse. The bone-deep composure of a man who had long ago decided what he was willing to do and had made peace with every last consequence. Wang In-ho. She didn't know his name yet. But the tattoos, the bearing, the way his men positioned themselves around him like satellites held in orbit by gravity they couldn't escape, everything about him screamed syndicate. Everything about him screamed run. Vera picked up another cup, hummed louder, moved toward the door with the unhurried pace of a woman whose biggest concern was whether the supply closet had enough disinfectant for tomorrow morning. Her heartbeat was a war drum. Her palms were slick. The door was 12 steps away. 10, 8. And if the girl doesn't cooperate, we take what we need and leave her where Whitmore's men will find her. She's leverage, not a priority. My brother is the only priority. Understood? Brother. He said brother. Something hot and sharp twisted behind Vera's ribs, a recognition she couldn't afford, a sympathy she hadn't earned the right to feel. She swallowed it. 6 steps. 4. She reached for the elevator button. A hand slammed against the white pillar beside her head. The sound cracked through the corridor like a gunshot, and Vera's entire body locked. The coffee tray trembled in her grip. She could see the hand fingers heavy with silver rings, knuckles illustrated with dark ink. a rose blooming across the back of his palm, as if beauty and violence had been planted in the same skin and learned to grow together. And then he leaned in. Close. Too close. Close enough that she could smell sandalwood and something metallic beneath it, like steel left out in the rain. Close enough that his breath moved the small hairs at her temple. His chest nearly touched her shoulder. He was tall, taller than she'd realized, and the way he angled his body against the wall created a cage of black fabric and tattooed skin that blocked the elevator, the corridor, the entire world behind them. Vera stared straight ahead. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and she could feel the mask, the careful, 14-month, painstakingly constructed mask of the oblivious assistant cracking along every edge. Her lips parted. She wanted to say something meaningless. "Excuse me, sir. Sorry, sir, I was just leaving, sir." But her voice had abandoned her, fled somewhere deep into her chest where it was curling into a fist. He tilted his head, studying her profile the way a man might study a lock he already knew how to pick. And then slowly, deliberately, he smiled. Not warmth, not charm, something darker. Something that said, "I have already won, and now I am simply deciding what to do with my victory." When he spoke, it wasn't in Korean. It was in English. Perfect, unhurried, flawless English. His voice dropped to a whisper that only she could hear. Intimate and lethal in equal measure, each word placed against her ear like the cold, flat edge of a blade. "I know you understood every word." The corridor seemed to lose its air. The golden sunset light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows turned the white walls amber, and for a single, suspended heartbeat, the gleaming tropical city outside the palm trees, the traffic, the vendors, the whole loud, living, indifferent world fell absolutely silent, as if even the city knew that something irreversible had just happened. Vera's carefully constructed life didn't shatter. It didn't crack. It simply evaporated, like breath on glass. One moment she was Vera, the assistant, harmless, forgettable, safe inside her silence. The next, she was standing in the ruins of her own disguise, pinned against a white pillar by a man whose tattooed hand rested beside her head like a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing. Her tray of coffee cups trembled once, then steadied. Because somewhere beneath the terror, beneath the 14 months of hiding and the 3 years of grief and the lifetime of learning to make herself small a different, Vera was waking up. The one who had crawled through court records at 3 a.m, the one who had stared down corrupt officials and published their names anyway, the one whose mother had given her a language like a weapon and told her, in Korean on the last coherent night of her life, "The world will try to make you quiet. You let them think it worked." Vera Diemer let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. And behind her wide, dark, terrified eyes, behind the shock and the adrenaline and the raw, animal certainty that her life had just split into before and after something ignited, small, defiant, red as the blouse pressed against the white wall. She did not run. Before we start, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share where you're watching from. It always warms my heart to see our little storytelling family stretch across the world. Every click, every comment, every bit of love you give helps us keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. So find your quiet place, settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've never been before. She pretended she couldn't understand him. Chapters 1-5. The elevator never came. Vera stood there with In-ho's hand flattened against the pillar beside her head, his body angled between her and every exit that mattered, and she watched the brushed steel doors ahead of her with the desperate, irrational hope of a woman who had run out of rational options. The digital display above the elevator read L Lobby, 41 floors below. An entire vertical city between her and the ground, and the man pinning her to this wall had all the patience in the world. His 2 men stood behind him like granite columns. They hadn't moved, hadn't shifted. They watched Vera with the flat, unsentimental gaze of professionals who had been in rooms where people made the wrong decision and were already calculating the cleanup. "You're trembling," In-ho said, still in that quiet, unhurried English. He hadn't pulled back. His tattooed hand remained beside her head, the rose across his knuckles close enough for her to count every petal inked into his skin. But your breathing is controlled, practiced. You're scared, but you're not panicking. That's interesting. Vera gripped the coffee tray so tightly her fingernails left crescent moons in her palms beneath it. She forced her voice out of hiding, made it small, made it bewildered, gave it the texture of a woman whose biggest emergency this week had been a jammed printer on the 34th floor. Sir, I don't understand. I was just cleaning. I don't know what you were saying in there. I don't speak. Stop. One word. Not loud, not angry. But it landed with the finality of a door closing, and Vera's rehearsed protest died in her throat like a candle blown out by a hand that didn't even need to try. In-ho tilted his head. The sunset caught the ink on his neck, geometric lines, sharp as architecture, disappearing beneath his collar like a blueprint of something only he could read. His dark eyes moved across her face with the methodical patience of a man disassembling a clock. When I mentioned the service corridor, he said softly, your left hand stopped moving for exactly 1 second. When I said my brother's name, your breathing changed. Not much. But I've spent my life reading people who are trying not to react. And you, he leaned closer. An inch. Maybe less. You are very good, but not good enough. The tray slipped from Vera's fingers. Coffee cups shattered on the marble floor, the sound obscenely loud in the silent corridor, and she flinched not at the crash, but at the realization that her body had just confirmed everything he suspected. She was shaking, actually shaking, not the performative tremor of a frightened assistant, but the deep cellular vibration of a woman watching the walls of her carefully built life collapse in real time. In-ho studied the broken ceramic at their feet. Then he looked back at her face, and something in his expression shifted, not softer, not kinder, but recalibrated. The way a man adjusts his grip on something he's decided to carry rather than discard. Here is what's going to happen, he said, switching to Korean so smoothly it was almost cruel. Because the shift itself was a test, a door he opened, just to see if her eyes would follow him through it. They did. She caught it a half-second too late, the involuntary flicker of comprehension crossing her face like lightning across a dark sky, there and gone but already seen. He smiled. That smile, the one that rearranged his entire face from threat to triumph, dark and unhurried and so certain of itself it was almost obscene. Then he switched back to English, because the point had been made. You're going to walk with me to the parking garage. You're going to get into my car, and you're going to listen to what I need from you. If you do this, your secret stays between us. If you don't, he straightened, finally pulling his hand from the wall, and the sudden absence of his proximity felt almost worse than the pressure of it. Then I make one phone call to Whitmore's head of security, and by morning, every camera in this building will have your face attached to a name that isn't the one on your badge. Vera's stomach dropped through the floor. He knew. Not just that she spoke Korean, he knew the badge was fake. He knew the identity was constructed. Which meant he had resources, contacts, people who could peel back layers that had taken her months to build. She thought about running. The stairwell was 20 feet to her left. She was fast, not fighter fast, but fear fast, the kind of speed that came from adrenaline and the absolute refusal to be caught. But his 2 men were already positioned. One near the stairwell, one near the elevator. Casual, almost bored. As if they'd done this so many times, the geometry of trapping someone had become second nature, a muscle memory as mundane as tying a shoe. Vera swallowed, straightened her spine, met In-ho's eyes for the first time without the filter of her disguise. And the rawness of it, of being truly looked at by someone who had already stripped her defenses away, was so disorienting she nearly stepped back. Fine, she said. Just that. 1 syllable. A surrender that tasted like battery acid. In-ho's smile widened by a fraction. Good girl, he said in Korean. And the words shouldn't have landed the way they did, shouldn't have sent something hot and furious spiraling through Vera's chest, but they did. Because he said them the way a man says checkmate, and Vera had never in her life been someone who accepted losing quietly. She followed him to the garage. The car was black, long, and quiet, the way expensive things are quiet, not the absence of sound but the deliberate muffling of it, as if even the engine had been trained to behave. Vera sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap, her crimson blouse damp with sweat between her shoulder blades, watching the city scroll past the tinted windows like a film she was no longer part of. The two bodyguards sat up front. In-ho sat beside her, his tattooed hand resting on his thigh, his silver rings catching the streetlights in rhythmic flashes as the car moved through the tropical night. He didn't speak for 3 blocks. The silence was strategic. Vera recognized the technique. Let the target sit in the uncertainty. Let them imagine every possible threat. Let their own fear do the work for you. She'd used the same tactic in interviews, back when she'd been the one asking the questions, back when she'd had the power to make powerful men sweat beneath their tailored suits. That version of herself felt like a ghost story now, something that had happened to a different woman in a different life. The Meridian Atlantic Tower has 17 sublevels. In-ho said finally, his gaze fixed on the window, watching the palm-lined boulevard and the distant shimmer of the harbor without appearing to see any of it. Officially, the building's architectural filings with the city record only 4. The remaining 13 are unlisted, unregistered. They don't exist on any public document. Vera said nothing. She knew about the sublevels. She'd spent 6 weeks trying to find a way down to them. I need the original architectural blueprints, he continued. Not the public filings, the real ones. The ones Whitmore's construction team used during the original build. They'll show every access point, every ventilation shaft, every corridor that the current security configuration doesn't cover. He turned his head and looked at her. You have access to the 34th floor records archive, employee badge, unrestricted after-hours clearance. You can get them. It wasn't a question. And if I refuse? Vera asked, though she already knew the answer. She asked because she needed to hear him say it. Needed to map the exact dimensions of the cage he was building around her, so she could start looking for the gaps. Then I send your real name, your real photograph, and a detailed summary of your activities over the past 14 months to Whitmore's private security team. They're thorough people. They'll find your apartment. They'll find your files. They'll find whatever half-built case you've been assembling against their employer. He paused. Let the words settle like dust after an explosion. And then you'll disappear. Not metaphorically. This city has a harbor, Vera. Things disappear into it all the time. Vera. He'd used her real name. Not Grace Okafor, the name on her badge. The fabricated identity she'd spent months constructing from stolen paperwork and borrowed history, but her real name. The name her mother had given her. The name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 14 months. It hit her like a slap, intimate and violent. My people ran your face through every database in this city the moment you flinched in that boardroom, he said, as if reading her shock. Grace Okafor doesn't exist. But Vera Diemer, disgraced journalist, daughter of a bankrupt shipping magnate, she exists. She exists very much. 48 hours, In-ho said. Bring me the blueprints. I'll contact you with a drop location. He reached across her and opened the car door. The night air humid, heavy, carrying the salt of the ocean, and the distant bass of a street musician's speaker rushed in like an uninvited guest. Don't think about running. I have people in that building. I'll know if you access the archive, and I'll know if you don't. Vera stepped out onto the sidewalk. The car pulled away before she'd finished closing the door, its red taillights swallowed by the traffic in seconds, and she stood there on the cracked pavement outside a pharmacy she'd never noticed before. Her heart hammering, her hands shaking, her crimson blouse clinging to her skin like a second heartbeat. She looked up at the sky. The stars were hidden behind the city's ambient glow, and somewhere in the distance, the Meridian Atlantic Tower rose against the darkness like a blade, its upper floors still lit, its secrets locked beneath 17 floors of reinforced concrete and armed men. 48 hours. Vera closed her eyes, breathed. And then she walked home, because the ledger was still down there, And now, whether she liked it or not, she had just been handed a reason to go looking for it. She stole the blueprints on a Saturday. The records archive on the 34th floor was a windowless room lined with filing cabinets and humming fluorescent lights that gave everything a faintly green, institutional pallor. It smelled like old paper and the particular brand of industrial carpet cleaner the janitorial team used on weekends. Vera had spent enough unremarkable hours restocking printer paper on this floor to know its rhythms. The security guard who took his break at 10:15, the motion sensor cameras that swept in predictable 40-second intervals, the supply closet with the faulty lock that provided access to the corridor connecting the archive to the east stairwell. She moved through the archive with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times. The original architectural blueprints were filed under a nondescript label, Matte Structural Orig 2009 inches, the third cabinet from the back wall. Vera pulled the file, photographed every page with the burner phone she kept taped inside the lining of her bag, and replaced the originals with the precision of a woman who understood that the difference between a successful theft and a death sentence was measured in millimeters. It took 11 minutes. She was back in the stairwell by 10:22, 3 minutes before the security guard returned from his break, her pulse steady, her face blank, her hands betraying nothing. But it was what she saw in the blueprints that changed everything. She spread the photographs across her kitchen table at 2 a.m, her apartment lit by a single desk lamp and the blue glow of her laptop screen. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom above a tailor shop in a neighborhood where the buildings leaned against each other like tired friends, and the mosquitoes were thick enough to constitute a weather event. But it was anonymous, paid for in cash, rented under a name that belonged to no one. Vera traced the sub-level corridors with her fingertip, and her blood cooled degree by degree. The blueprints showed 17 descending levels, just as Inho had said. But what they also showed, what the original construction team had drawn in precise, unforgiving detail, was the security infrastructure Whitmore had installed after the initial build. Handwritten annotations in red ink, added later, marking modifications that had never been filed with the city. Reinforced steel doors on sublevels 9 through 13. Biometric checkpoints every 60 meters. And on sublevel 15, a notation that made Vera's throat close. Armed Patrol 24 HR, rotating teams of 6. 6 armed guards, around the clock, on a single floor. Whatever was down there, whatever Whitmore was protecting in that vault, it was worth killing for. And Wang In-ho, with his 2 bodyguards and his rolled-up sleeves and his quiet, lethal confidence, was planning to walk into a corridor patrolled by men who carried automatic weapons and had been paid enough to use them without asking questions. This wasn't a heist. This was a suicide mission. Vera sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. A gecko clung to the plaster above her, motionless, watching her with tiny black eyes that reflected the lamplight. She thought about handing over the blueprints and walking away. Let In-ho throw himself against Whitmore's fortress. Let him discover the armed patrols on his own. It wasn't her problem. She had her own mission, her own dead to avenge, her own ledger to steal. But the ledger was in the same vault, the same sublevel, the same corridor guarded by men with guns. And if In-ho breached that vault, if he was willing to die trying, then his chaos might be the only window Vera would ever get. She picked up the burner phone, dialed the number he'd left in a folded note tucked beneath her apartment door because, of course, he knew where she lived. Of course he did. The man collected information the way other men collected watches. He answered on the second ring. "The blueprints are ready," she said. "But we need to talk. Not on the phone. In person." A pause. She could hear city sounds behind him. A car horn, distant music, the particular hum of a neighborhood that never fully slept. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll send an address." And he hung up without saying goodbye, because men like Wang In-ho didn't perform the small courtesies of conversation. They simply arrived and left, like weather. The address was a penthouse. Because of course it was. It occupied the top 2 floors of a residential tower on the harbor side of the city, the kind of building that had a doorman who wore white gloves and a lobby that smelled like orchids and money. Vera arrived in the late afternoon, still wearing her work clothes, the crimson blouse, dark trousers, sensible shoes because she wanted to remind him that she was the assistant, the nobody. The furniture he had rearranged for his own purposes. A small, petty act of resistance. She was aware of how childish it was. She didn't care. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, which meant he owned the entire floor, which meant the kind of wealth that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. The space was vast. Concrete floors. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, framing a panoramic view of the harbor and the city skyline. The late afternoon sun turning the water to hammered gold. The furniture was minimal dark leather, clean lines, everything chosen for function rather than display. The walls were bare except for a single piece of calligraphy in a black frame. Korean characters brushed in ink so fluid they looked like they were still moving. In-ho stood by the window with his back to her, a glass of something amber in his tattooed hand, watching the harbor the way a general watches a battlefield before the first shot is fired. He'd changed from the black dress shirt. Now it was a charcoal Henley, pushed to his elbows, the ink on full display, every mark she'd catalogued in the corridor now visible in its entirety, crawling up his forearms like a visual autobiography she hadn't been invited to read. He didn't turn around when the elevator opened, didn't greet her, simply said in Korean, "You brought the blueprints." Statement, not question. Vera walked to the concrete island that divided the open kitchen from the living space, set the burner phone on the surface, and opened the gallery of photographs. Then she crossed her arms and waited. In-ho turned. His gaze moved from her face to the phone to the blueprints glowing on the small screen. He walked over, picked up the phone, and scrolled. His expression didn't change. Not once. Not when he saw the reinforced doors, not when he saw the biometric checkpoints, not when he reached the red ink annotation about the armed patrols on sub-level 15. But his hand tightened around the glass. The amber liquid trembled once, then stilled. "You're going to die down there," Vera said. She said it in Korean because the masks were off now and there was no point pretending otherwise. 6 armed guards on a 24-hour rotation, and that's just one floor. The vault itself will have its own security retinal scans, pressure sensors, the kind of system that doesn't have a back door because it was designed by people who assume someone like you is coming. In-ho set the phone down, looked at her. His expression was unreadable, the composure of a man who had heard his own death described to him and found it insufficiently interesting to warrant a reaction. "Someone like me," he repeated. "A syndicate boss with 3 men and a grudge. Yes." Vera held his gaze. Her heart was pounding. It always pounded around him, a biological mutiny she resented with every fiber of her being, but her voice was steady. "Whatever Whitmore took from you, whatever is in that vault that you're willing to die for, you need more than blueprints and bravado. You need someone inside, someone who knows the building, someone who has been walking those halls for 14 months, mapping the guard rotations, learning the system, becoming invisible enough to move through it." The silence that followed was so thick she could feel it pressing against her skin. In-ho's eyes narrowed. Not suspicion, reassessment. The expression of a man recalculating an equation after discovering a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You're not an assistant," he said. "No." "You're not a spy." "No." "Then what are you?" Vera uncrossed her arms, let her hands fall to her sides. Felt the full, terrible weight of what she was about to do, the confession that would strip away the last layer of armor between herself and a man who could destroy her with a phone call. But the ledger was in that vault, and he was her way in. "My name is Vera Diemer," she said. 3 years ago, I was an investigative journalist. I published an exposé linking Whitmore's corporation to a network of fraudulent acquisitions along the coast. Before it went to print, Whitmore's lawyers had the story killed, my editor fired, and my credentials revoked. 6 months later, my father's shipping company, the company Whitmore had already hollowed out from the inside, was seized in a bankruptcy filing that had been engineered from the start. My father died 8 months after that. Heart attack. My mother was already gone. She paused, swallowed. The ledger, the physical record of every transaction Whitmore has buried is in your vault. And I have spent 14 months becoming a ghost in his building, so I could find a way to steal it. In-ho stared at her. For the first time since she'd met him, the composure cracked not much, not dramatically, but enough. A flicker in his dark eyes, a shift in his posture. The barely perceptible exhale of a man who had just realized that the pawn he'd been pushing across the board was, in fact, a queen who had been playing her own game the entire time. "My brother," he said quietly. And now it was his turn to confess, his turn to stand exposed in the late afternoon light of his own penthouse, the harbor glittering behind him like something holy. His name is Min Jun. He's 22. He came to this city because I told him it was safe, because I told him the business I was building here was clean, legitimate. In-ho's jaw tightened, a muscle feathered beneath the tattoo on his neck. Whitmore found out who I was, what I represented. He took Min Jun 5 weeks ago. He's holding him in the sublevels as collateral insurance that I'll cooperate, that I'll use my network to move his product without interference. If I go to the police, Min Jun dies. If I refuse, Min Jun dies. If I do anything other than exactly what Whitmore demands, Min Jun dies, Vera finished. In-ho looked at her, and in that look, stripped of the smirk, stripped of the dominance, stripped of every performance he'd given since the moment he'd slammed his hand against that white pillar, she saw something she recognized. Something she carried in her own chest like a stone she couldn't put down. Grief, the specific, suffocating grief of a person who has failed someone they were supposed to protect. "I'm not planning a heist," he said. "I'm planning a rescue, and I was planning to die doing it because I didn't see another option." He paused, looked at the blueprints glowing on the phone between them. "Until you." They spent the night at the concrete island. Not the way the word night sometimes implies, not with softness or surrender or any of the things that happen when two people stop fighting. This was operational, strategic. Two people with overlapping targets and complementary skills, mapping a path through the most dangerous building in the city with nothing but stolen blueprints, Vera's 14 months of institutional knowledge, and In-ho's network of contacts who owed him favors dangerous enough to make grown men sweat. In-ho ordered food at some point delivery from a place that didn't ask questions and arrived in unmarked containers. They ate standing up, passing cartons of jollof rice and grilled suya between them without ceremony, fueling the work the way soldiers fuel a march. Vera spread her own notes across the island beside his hand-drawn maps of guard schedules, elevator access logs she'd copied from the security office during a lunch break 3 months ago, a list of every blind spot in the camera system that she'd identified by walking the building's corridors with the obsessive patience of someone who understood that survival was a matter of geometry. "The gala," she said, circling a date on the calendar she'd pulled up on her laptop. "Whitmore's annual investor showcase, 4 days from now. The top floor will be packed 300 guests, catering staff, external security hired for the event. Every resource Whitmore has will be focused upward. The sublevels will be running on skeleton crew." In-ho leaned over the island beside her, his forearm close enough to hers that she could see the individual feathers on the swallows inked across his skin. He smelled like whiskey and something warmer beneath it. Cedar, maybe, or the particular scent of a man who had spent the day in leather furniture and expensive fabric. She hated that she'd noticed. Hated even more that noticing had become a reflex she couldn't turn off, like flinching at a loud sound or blinking in bright light. "I go in as a guest," he said. "The investor cover is already built. Sung Min created the paper trail 6 weeks ago, Shell Company, portfolio history, references that trace back to contacts in Seoul. Whitmore's people vetted me. I'm already on the guest list." "And Sung Min?" Vera asked. "During the gala?" "Stationed outside. He'll be in a van on the service road behind the loading docks with a signal relay and a police scanner. If anything goes wrong inside, he's our extraction." In-ho's expression made it clear that anything going wrong was not a hypothetical he treated lightly. "J1 comes in with me. Sungmin stays mobile. And I attend as staff," Vera said, "which gives me access to every service corridor, every utility closet, every back channel the guests never see. During the gala, while Whitmore's security is focused on the top floor, I plant listening devices on the 38th floor. That's the Security Operations Center. If we can hear what they're hearing, we'll know exactly when the sub-level patrols change shifts. And the cameras? Vera pulled up a schematic on her laptop. There are 46 security cameras between the lobby and sub-level 17. 31 of them route through a centralized server on the 36th floor. I've spent 2 months figuring out the access protocols. During the gala, the IT staff runs a skeleton crew, 1 technician monitoring remotely. I can scramble the feeds for a 6-minute window, maybe 8 if the technician is slow. Inho looked at her. Not at the schematic, not at the blueprints, not at the calendar, at her. And the weight of his gaze was something Vera felt physically, a pressure against her ribs, a heat at the back of her neck, a gravitational pull she was expending an embarrassing amount of energy trying to resist. "You've been planning this," he said, not an accusation, something closer to admiration, though the word felt too soft for the way he said it. "Long before I showed up. I've been planning this since the day I walked into that building with a fake name and a dead mother's language in my mouth," Vera said. "You just accelerated the timeline." A silence settled between them, not hostile, not comfortable. Something in between the particular quality of quiet that exists between two people who have just shown each other the most dangerous parts of themselves and are still deciding whether that was brave or suicidal. Inho reached for the glass of whiskey he'd been nursing for the past hour. His silver rings clinked against the crystal. He took a slow sip, watching her over the rim with those dark, unreadable eyes, and Vera felt the tension in the room shift, felt it pivot from operational to something else, something that had been building since the moment he'd pinned her against that white pillar and whispered her disguise apart. "You could have run," he said. "After the blueprints, you could have handed them over and disappeared. Changed your name again. Started over somewhere Whitmore couldn't find you. So, could you?" Vera said. "You could take your men and leave. Forget the vault. Forget your brother. Start over somewhere that doesn't have 17 sub-levels of armed guards waiting to kill you." The words were cruel. She knew it the moment they left her mouth, felt the cruelty of them like a blade she'd drawn across someone else's wound. But she needed to say them, because the alternative was admitting what was actually happening in this penthouse, at this concrete island. In the warm amber light of the harbor sunset, which was that she was sitting across from a man who understood her grief because he was carrying the same weight, and that understanding was more dangerous than any weapon Whitmore had in his vault. Inho didn't flinch. He set the glass down, looked at her with an expression that was almost gentle, which was terrifying coming from a face that had been engineered for menace. "My brother is 22, he said quietly. "He plays guitar, badly. He burns every meal he tries to cook. He calls me young even when he's angry at me, which is most of the time, because I've spent his entire life making decisions that kept him safe, but never made him happy." He paused. "I'm not leaving this city without him." Vera stared at the blueprints, at the red ink annotations marking the armed patrols, at the vault that held both a captive boy who played guitar badly and a ledger that could resurrect her family's name from the grave. "Then we do this together," she said. Inho extended his hand across the concrete island. The gesture was almost absurdly formal. A handshake, a business agreement, the kind of ritual that belonged in boardrooms, not in a harborfront penthouse between a disgraced journalist and a syndicate boss plotting to break into the most secure building in the city. Vera took his hand. His grip was warm, firm, the silver rings pressed cool against her fingers. The tattooed rose on his knuckle aligned with the inside of her wrist. And for a moment, one unguarded, electric, terrifying moment, neither of them let go. Then Vera pulled her hand back, and Inho returned to the blueprints, and neither of them acknowledged what had just happened, because acknowledging it would mean naming it, and naming it would mean admitting that somewhere between the blackmail and the blueprints, and the shared grief of people who had lost everything, a line had been crossed that neither of them knew how to uncross. They worked until 3 in the morning. Vera fell asleep at the island with her head on her folded arms, the blueprint still glowing on her laptop screen, and when she woke at dawn to the pale gray light of the harbor creeping across the concrete floor, there was a blanket draped over her shoulders that hadn't been there before. In-ho was standing by the window, watching the sun rise over the city, a fresh cup of coffee in his tattooed hand. He didn't turn around, but he'd covered her while she slept. And Vera, who had spent 3 years building walls so high she'd forgotten what the sky looked like from the other side, felt something crack in the architecture of her solitude. Small, almost imperceptible, like the first fracture in a dam that doesn't yet know it's breaking. She folded the blanket without a word, packed her things, and left. 4 days passed like a held breath. Vera moved through the Meridian Atlantic Tower with the same vacant expression, the same pleasant nod, the same crimson blouse and braided crown, but beneath the surface, everything had changed. She was no longer a ghost. She was a weapon with a countdown, and the building she haunted had become the terrain of a war that was 4 days away from detonation. She planted the first listening device on a Tuesday, slipping it beneath the reception desk on the 38th floor during a routine delivery of office supplies. The device was the size of a shirt button courtesy of In-ho's network, smuggled into her apartment in a bag of groceries left at her door without a note or a name. She planted the second device in the ceiling tile of the Security Operations Center's break room on Wednesday during a fire drill that cleared the floor for 12 minutes. The third she affixed to the underside of the main security console itself, her hands steady, her smile empty, her body performing the choreography of harmlessness, while her mind ran calculations that would have made Whitmore's head of security weep. In-ho communicated through dead drops, notes left in her mailbox, a burner phone that buzzed twice a day with coordinates, times, instructions stripped of anything personal or warm. The intimacy of the penthouse, the blanket, the shared grief, the handshake that lasted 3 seconds too long had been sealed behind a wall of operational precision, and Vera was grateful for it. Grateful and something else, something she refused to examine. The day of the gala arrived on a Saturday that dawned so bright and hot the city seemed to vibrate. The Meridian Atlantic Tower had been transformed. The top floor, a vast open event space with retractable glass walls overlooking the harbor, was dressed in white linen, crystal, and enough imported flowers to fill a funeral home. Catering teams moved through the service corridors like an invading army of starched uniforms and silver trays. External security hired privately, vetted by Whitmore's team, took positions at every entrance, every stairwell, every elevator bank, their earpieces and dark suits turning them into a human perimeter around the most powerful people in the city. Vera arrived at 7 in the morning in her staff uniform. Not the crimson blouse today, she was catering staff, anonymous in black trousers and a white button-down, her braided crown tucked beneath a plain black headband, her face scrubbed clean of anything that might make her memorable. She carried a tray of champagne flutes and a small wireless signal scrambler the size of a cigarette lighter hidden in the waistband of her trousers. By 9, the 36th floor was down to a single IT technician monitoring remotely from a tablet in the break room. Vera delivered him a coffee and a pastry from the gala prep kitchen, smiled the smile of a woman who was thinking about nothing at all, and noted the exact angle of his tablet screen reflected in the window behind him. She had his access code in 40 seconds. The scrambler would handle the rest when the time came. At noon, the guests began arriving. Vera saw him before she recognized him. A man stepping out of a black town car on the circular drive below the building's entrance, wearing a suit so precisely tailored, it looked like it had been designed not for his body, but for the specific way he intended to destroy the evening. Navy blue, no tie. White shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the gold chain catching the tropical sun, the neck tattoo hidden, no, not hidden. Managed. A high collar, angled just so. The ink on his hands was covered by thin, flesh-colored gloves, so well made they were invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. And Vera knew what she was looking for. Wang In-ho walked into the Meridian Atlantic Tower's annual investor gala with the bearing of a man who owned half of Seoul and was considering purchasing the other half. His cover identity, a venture capitalist named David Kang, preceded him in the form of a portfolio so convincing that 3 actual investors had already tried to schedule meetings with him. He shook hands. He smiled. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and surveyed the room with the gracious, predatory ease of someone who had learned to weaponize charm the same way other men weaponized fists. Vera watched from the service corridor, her tray balanced on her forearm, her heart doing something complicated and inconvenient behind her ribs. He found her once, just once, in the gap between the kitchen and the main event space, a corridor so narrow that 2 people could not pass without turning sideways. He was walking toward the restroom, or pretending to, and she was carrying an empty tray back to the kitchen, and for 3 seconds, they were alone. He didn't stop, didn't speak, but as he passed, his hand brushed hers a touch so brief it could have been accidental, except that nothing Wang In-ho did was accidental. His fingers grazed her wrist, and she felt the pressure of something small and hard pressed into her palm. A wireless earpiece, flesh-colored, nearly invisible. She closed her fist around it without breaking stride. In the kitchen, hidden behind a rack of champagne bottles, she fitted the earpiece into her left ear. Static. Then his voice, low and calm, speaking Korean with the measured cadence of a man reciting coordinates on a battlefield. "I'm on the top floor. Whitmore is in the East Wing with his security chief. The building's perimeter team has been doubled. They brought in 12 additional men this morning. Something's wrong. He knows someone is coming." A chill crawled up the back of Vera's neck. "Stay on schedule," she murmured, her lips barely moving, her hands arranging glasses on the tray with mechanical precision. "I'll have the cameras down by 8. The listening devices are active. I can hear the security channel. If anything changes, you'll know before they do." A pause. Then his voice again, quieter now, almost private. "The red suits you better." Vera's hand stilled on the champagne glass. Heat bloomed across her cheeks, traitorous, involuntary, furious. She bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. "Focus," she said, "or your brother dies in a basement because you couldn't stop flirting for 5 minutes." She heard him exhale. Not a laugh. Something adjacent to a laugh. Something that, in a different life, a life where she wasn't wearing a wire and he wasn't wearing a disguise, and they weren't both about to commit crimes that could get them killed, might have been the beginning of something. Neither of them was ready to name. "Copy," he said, and the line went quiet. Vera picked up her tray, straightened her spine, walked back into the gala with her face arranged into the pleasant, vacant expression of a woman whose only concern was whether the guests needed more sparkling water. Above her, 300 people in evening wear drank and laughed and performed the rituals of wealth. Beneath her, 17 floors below the marble lobby, a 22-year-old boy who played guitar badly waited in the dark. And in between, in the narrow, electrified space, between the surface and the underground, between the mask and the truth, between the woman in white and the man in navy blue, the clock was ticking. If Vera and In-ho's deadly alliance has you on the edge of your seat, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next chapter is going to be insane. Comment below, Team Ledger or Team Rescue. And tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Don't miss what happens next. The gala has started, the trap is set, and their lives are about to face the deadliest test yet. See you in the next. It happened at 7:47 p.m., 13 minutes before Vera was scheduled to scramble the cameras. She was in the service corridor between the kitchen and the East Wing elevator bank, balancing a tray of empty champagne flutes and listening to the security channel through the devices she'd planted 3 days ago, when she heard the name that stopped her blood. Confirm identity on the investor David Kang. Cross-reference just came back from Seoul. The portfolio is fabricated. Repeat. The portfolio is fabricated. The man on the top floor is Wang In-ho. Syndicate. Armed and extremely dangerous. Director Whitmore has authorized silent containment. No guests are to be alerted. I want a 6-man team on every exit. No one leaves the 42nd floor without clearance. Lethal force is authorized. Vera's tray hit the corridor wall. She caught it before it fell muscle memory. The reflexes of a woman who had spent 14 months training her body to perform normalcy, even when her mind was detonating. But 2 glasses slipped and shattered on the tile floor, and a passing kitchen porter glanced at her with mild annoyance. "Sorry," she whispered, smiled, bent to collect the shards with hands that were trembling so badly she cut her thumb on a broken rim and didn't feel it. Lethal force. 6-man teams on every exit. Silent containment, which was Whitmore's polished, corporate euphemism for kill him quietly and clean up before the dessert course. Vera pressed her earpiece. In Ho. Static. In Ho, they know. They know who you are. Whitmore's authorized lethal force. There are teams moving to every exit on the 42nd floor. You need to move. Now. Nothing. The earpiece hissed with the hollow, indifferent static of a dead channel, and Vera felt something open beneath her ribs, a trapdoor of panic she hadn't known existed, dropping her stomach into freefall. The signal was being jammed. Whitmore's security team had activated a localized frequency suppressor on the top floor, standard protocol for high-value containment, and In-Ho was up there with 300 oblivious guests and a closing net of armed men, and he couldn't hear her. She abandoned the tray, left it on the corridor floor with the broken glass and the blood from her thumb smeared across the handle, and she moved. Not toward the top floor, she couldn't get there. The elevators were already locked to security-only access, and the stairwells would be covered. She moved downward, toward the 36th floor, toward the server room, toward the only place in this building where she could reach every speaker, every screen, every system that Whitmore's empire ran on. The server room was cold, not cool cold, the kind of aggressive, mechanical chill that existed solely to keep machines alive, indifferent to the comfort of any human who happened to be standing among them. Vera swiped in with the access code she'd memorized from the IT technician's tablet reflection 3 days ago, and the door sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss that sounded, in the silence, like the building exhaling. Rows of black server racks stretched before her, blinking with green and amber lights, humming with the collective data of a corporation that had been built on stolen lives. The security monitors were mounted on the far wall, 16 screens showing feeds from every floor. Vera's eyes went to the top right quadrant, the 42nd floor, the gala. She saw him immediately. In-Ho was standing near the east window, a champagne glass in his gloved hand, his posture immaculate, his expression carrying the easy, practiced warmth of a man enjoying an evening among peers. He was talking to a woman in a green dress, nodding, smiling, performing the role of David Kang with the seamless conviction of someone who had learned early that identity was just another tool. He looked relaxed. He looked like he belonged. But on the adjacent monitors, Vera could see what he couldn't. 6 men in dark suits entering from the north stairwell, 4 more from the south service corridor, 2 positioned at the main elevator bank, their jackets subtly bulging at the hip. They moved through the crowd like shadows, not running, not drawing attention, just tightening, closing the distance between themselves and the man by the east window with the patient, mechanical precision of a trap designed by someone who had done this before. 12 men, 12 guns, and In-Ho standing in the middle of them with a champagne glass and no idea that the room he was performing in had just become a kill box. Vera's hands flew across the server room's main console. She'd studied this system for months, mapped its architecture, identified its vulnerabilities, traced every cable and connection until she could navigate it blindfolded. The building's PA system ran through a centralized audio distribution server on Rack 14. It was designed for fire alarms, emergency announcements, and the occasional building-wide memo from management. It was not designed for what Vera was about to use it for. She accessed the audio routing panel, isolated the 42nd floor's speaker array, linked it to the server room's internal microphone, a small, directional unit mounted above the console for maintenance communication. And then she did the thing she had spent 14 months, 3 years, an entire reconstructed identity trying to avoid. She opened her mouth, and she stopped being invisible. In-Ho. Her voice erupted from every speaker on the 42nd floor. Not loud, she'd calibrated the volume to cut through conversation without triggering a stampede, but clear, unmistakable. Speaking Korean with the fluency of someone who had been born into the language, raised by it, shaped by it, carrying it in her chest like a second heartbeat she'd been hiding from the world. On the security monitor, she saw In-ho's head snap up, saw the champagne glass freeze halfway to his lips, saw his dark eyes widen not with fear, but with recognition. He knew her voice. Even through speakers, even distorted by distance and electronic compression, he knew it was her. 6 men approaching from the north stairwell, 4 from the south corridor, 2 at the main elevator. They're armed. Whitmore knows who you are. Lethal force is authorized. You have approximately 90 seconds before they're in position. On the monitor, In-ho set down the champagne glass. The movement was so calm, so deliberate, that anyone watching him would have thought he was simply finished with his drink. But Vera saw his shoulders change, saw the shift from performance to preparation, the subtle dropping of weight into his legs, the way his gloved hands opened at his sides like a man about to catch something thrown at him hard. The east service corridor behind you, the one marked Staff Only, beside the window display. It connects to a freight elevator that bypasses the main bank. The freight elevator still has power because it's on a separate circuit from the guest elevators. Take it to the 38th floor. From there, you can access the east stairwell to the sublevels. The stairwell camera is the third one. I scrambled the feed, is looping a 30-second empty corridor on repeat. You'll have a 4-minute window. In-ho moved. He didn't run. Running would trigger every instinct in every armed man on the floor. He walked. That same liquid, unhurried stride that had terrified Vera the first time she'd seen it. The walk of a man who moved through dangerous rooms like he'd been born in them. He angled toward the east wall, passing a cluster of investors discussing something about quarterly returns, nodding to a server who offered him a canapé. And then, in the gap between 2 potted palms and the frosted glass panel marking the staff corridor, he vanished. Vera watched him disappear from the 42nd floor camera feed and reappear on the freight elevator's interior camera 6 seconds later. Her hands were shaking. Her cut thumb was bleeding onto the console. She didn't notice. Freight elevator moving. You'll pass the 39th and 38th floors, both are clear. When you reach 38, exit left. The east stairwell access is 40 meters down the corridor, last door before the fire suppression panel. On the 42nd floor, the security team had reached In-ho's last known position. She watched them converge on the east window like a fist closing around empty air. The woman in the green dress was being quietly escorted away. A man with an earpiece was speaking rapidly into his wrist, his face tight with the particular fury of someone who had just lost a target in a locked room. They know you've moved. They're sweeping the floor. You have maybe 3 minutes before they check the freight elevator logs and figure out where you went. In-ho's voice came through the PA system's return channel, a small speaker mounted in the server room ceiling, designed for 2-way maintenance communication. His voice was calm, controlled. But beneath the control, Vera heard something she'd never heard from him before. Trust. I'm on 38, heading for the stairwell. What's waiting for me below? Vera pulled up the sub-level camera feeds. The scrambler she'd planted was working. The main security feeds were looping, showing empty corridors to whoever was monitoring them from the operations center. But the server room gave her access to the raw, unscrambled feeds, the real ones. Sub-level 9 has 2 guards at the reinforced door. They're on a rotation. One patrols the corridor every 12 minutes. The other stays stationary. The patrol guard left his post approximately 4 minutes ago, which means you have 8 minutes before he returns. Sub-level 15, the vault level, has a reduced crew, 4 guards instead of 6. The gala pulled 2 of them upstairs for perimeter duty. She heard him descending. The faint echo of his footsteps in the stairwell transmitted through the building's intercom network, each step measured and deliberate. Sub-level 9 door is biometric. Your gloves. Already off. Of course. Of course he'd already anticipated it. Vera bit back something that was either frustration or admiration and pulled up the biometric access logs. The system accepts a 4-second press on the scanner. If it rejects, It locks for 60 seconds before allowing another attempt. You get one chance. Whose print does it accept? Whitmore's security chief, director of building operations, and Vera's fingers flew across the keyboard, scrolling through the access database she'd copied 3 weeks ago. Maintenance supervisor, Park Dong-hyun. He was fired 2 weeks ago. His biometric profile hasn't been purged from the system yet. A pause. Then, through the speaker, Park Dong-hyun is my cousin. Why do you think I put him in that building? Vera closed her eyes. Of course. Of course, In-ho had planted a relative inside the Meridian Atlantic Tower months before any of this began, not just for intelligence, but for access. A biometric profile registered to the system, a key left in the lock long after the locksmith had been dismissed. Tell me you have his print, she said. Silicone overlay, left index finger. Dong-hyun cast it himself before Whitmore's people walked him out of the building. A beat of silence. I've been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for tonight. Then you have access. Go. She watched him on the raw feed, sub-level 9, the reinforced door. He pressed a thin, nearly invisible film over his left index finger, a silicone prosthetic, so precisely molded it would fool any capacitive scanner, and placed his hand flat against the panel. 4 seconds. The light turned green. The door opened. And Vera Diemer, alone in a freezing server room 17 floors above a vault that held everything she had lost and everything he was trying to save, guided Wang In-ho through the dark like a voice in the walls. Like a woman who had stopped being furniture and remembered, finally, catastrophically, what it felt like to be fire. She met him on sub-level 14. The stairwell door opened, and there he was, the navy suit rumpled now, the white shirt untucked, the flesh-colored gloves gone, his tattooed hands bare, and carrying a compact pistol that hadn't been there when he'd walked into the gala. One of his men, Jae-won, the quieter of the 2 bodyguards, was behind him, bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow, but moving with the grim determination of someone who had decided that injuries were irrelevant until the mission was over. Vera had left the server room 6 minutes ago. She'd set the camera scrambler to run on a timed loop, locked the server room door with an override code that would take Whitmore's IT team at least 20 minutes to crack, and descended through the east stairwell, with nothing but the signal scrambler in her waistband, and a fire extinguisher she'd pulled from the wall on sub-level 12, because it was heavy and solid, and she had learned a long time ago that the best weapon was the one nobody expected you to carry. In-ho saw her and stopped. His dark eyes moved across her face, the white catering shirt, the blood on her thumb. The fire extinguisher gripped in both hands, like a woman who fully intended to use it, and something crossed his expression that was too raw and too fast for Vera to catalog. Relief, anger, something between the two that didn't have a name in any of the languages she spoke. I told you to secure the ledger and leave, he said in Korean. Low, intense, the voice of a man who had made a plan and watched it detonate. And I told you that you'd die down here without me, Vera said. Guess which one of us was right. A sound echoed up the stairwell behind them, boots on concrete, the rhythmic, unhesitating footfalls of men descending with purpose. Whitmore's security team had found the freight elevator logs. They were coming. In-ho grabbed her arm not roughly, but with an urgency that said we are out of time, and pulled her through the sub-level 14 corridor toward the descending staircase. Jae-won fell in behind them, his gun raised, covering the rear with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this in buildings far worse than this one. Sub-level 15, the vault level. The corridor was lit with flat, industrial fluorescence that turned everything the color of bone. Vera could feel the weight of the building above her, 42 floors of glass and marble and wealth pressing down on them like a conscience. The air was different down here, colder, drier, scrubbed of anything organic. It smelled like recycled air and concrete dust and the faint, metallic tang of something Vera didn't want to identify. 2 guards at the vault door. They saw In-ho first, saw the gun, the tattoos, the expression on his face that said, I am not here to negotiate, and in the 3 seconds it took for their training to kick in. Jae-won had already moved. The bodyguard was efficient, clinical. He disarmed the first guard with a strike to the wrist that Vera heard more than saw, and had the second on the ground before the man's hand reached his holster. The guards were zip-tied and gagged with their own radio straps in under a minute. The vault door was steel, reinforced, the kind of door that was designed to survive explosions and looked like it resented having to open for anyone. The biometric panel beside it glowed with a soft blue light, the same system as Sub-Level 9, the same database, the same oversight that had left a fired maintenance supervisor's credentials active in the system. In-Ho pressed the silicone overlay to the scanner one more time. 4 seconds. Green. The door opened with a pneumatic groan that sounded like the building itself was reluctant to reveal what it had been hiding, and the air that rushed out carried a smell Vera recognized: damp concrete, human sweat, the sour undertone of fear that had been marinating in an enclosed space for weeks. Min-Jun was in the corner. He was sitting on a thin mattress on the floor, his back against the concrete wall, his wrists raw from restraints that had been recently removed, probably in anticipation of the gala. When the guards would have been pulled upstairs and the boy left locked in a room he couldn't escape regardless, he was thin. Thinner than anyone should be after 5 weeks in a basement. His dark hair was matted, his clothes a t-shirt and track pants, the kind of thing you'd be wearing if someone snatched you on a Tuesday morning and never gave you the chance to change, were stained and torn. But his eyes, when they found his brother standing in the doorway with a gun in his tattooed hand and blood on his shirt, were wide and bright and devastating in their relief. Young. One word. Cracked. Broken at the edges. The sound of a 22-year-old boy who had spent 5 weeks wondering if he would die in a room without windows, saying the only word that had ever meant safety. In-Ho crossed the vault in 3 strides. He dropped to his knees beside his brother, and for the first time since Vera had met him since the white pillar, the whispered threat, the penthouse, the Gala Wang. In-Ho's composure shattered completely. His hands cupped Min-Jun's face, his forehead pressed against his brother's. He said something in Korean so quiet Vera couldn't hear it, but the shape of it, the shape of a man's mouth forming the words, "I'm sorry, I'm here, I'm sorry," was unmistakable. Vera turned away, not out of embarrassment or discomfort, but out of respect for a grief that had just ended, a vigil that had just broken, a reunion that belonged entirely to 2 brothers and no one else. She found the ledger. It was exactly where the blueprint suggested it would be, a reinforced filing cabinet bolted to the vault's west wall, sealed with a combination lock that Vera had cracked in her head 6 months ago, using the combination she'd found scrawled in barely legible handwriting on the back of a maintenance request form in the 34th floor. Archive. 3 turns. Click. The drawer slid open, and inside, bound in unmarked black leather, was the physical accounting record of every illicit transaction Charles Whitmore had ever authorized. Every shipment, every payment, every name, the skeleton key to an empire built on trafficking and fraud and the systematic destruction of anyone who got too close. Vera lifted the ledger with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, not physically, but in every other way that mattered. This was 3 years of her life. This was her father's name. This was her mother's last wish, spoken in Korean on a hospital bed that smelled like disinfectant and dying flowers. Make them pay. Make the world see what they did to us. She held it against her chest, closed her eyes, breathed. Then she turned to In-Ho, who was helping Min-Jun to his feet, the younger man's arm draped over his brother's shoulder, and said the only thing that mattered. "We need to move, now." The loading docks were 3 sub-levels below the vault. They descended through a maintenance corridor that wasn't on the public blueprints, a narrow, unfinished concrete passage that smelled like diesel and humidity, lit by caged bulbs that flickered every time the building's climate system cycled. Vera led the way because she'd memorized the route 4 nights ago at In-Ho's concrete island, tracing it with her fingertip until the turns were carved into her muscle memory. In-Ho followed, with Min-Jun leaning against him, the younger man stumbling but moving, his jaw set with a determination that looked painfully familiar, the same stubbornness Vera had seen in his brother's face, the genetic inheritance of men who refused to collapse when collapse was the easier option. J1 covered the rear. His gun was up. His breathing was steady. Vera had decided she owed him something significant if they survived this. The loading docks were a vast, low-ceilinged space that occupied the building's entire basement footprint. Delivery trucks, cargo containers, pallets stacked with construction materials and industrial supplies that provided cover and shadow in equal measure. The overhead doors, 4 of them, massive steel shutters that opened onto the service road behind the building, were closed. The dock's security panel was mounted beside the first door, a keypad that required an authorization code Vera didn't have. But the dock's emergency release did not require a code. It required a fire alarm. Vera pulled the red handle on the wall. The sound was apocalyptic. Every siren in the sublevels detonated simultaneously, a shrieking, ear-splitting wall of noise that bounced off the concrete walls and turned the loading dock into a chamber of chaos. The overhead doors began their automatic ascent, motors grinding, steel panels rolling upward to reveal the night outside, humid air, city lights, the distant wail of actual fire trucks already responding to the alarm. And beyond the doors, freedom. A service road. A line of parked delivery trucks. And at the far end of the road, headlights flashing twice, Sung Min, in the unmarked van, exactly where they'd positioned him 4 days ago at the concrete island. The tropical city stretching in every direction, loud and bright and indifferent, a million lives continuing while 3 people ran for theirs. They made it to the second delivery truck before the reinforcements arrived. Vera heard them before she saw them, boots pounding through the loading dock behind them, shouts in English and Korean, the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Whitmore's men, a dozen of them at least, pouring from the internal stairwell like water through a broken dam. In-ho shoved Min-jun into the truck's cab, turned, raised his weapon, fired 2 shots into the ceiling above the stairwell entrance, not to hit anyone, but to create a cascade of concrete dust and sparks that forced the advancing men to scatter, buying 3 seconds of confusion. 3 seconds was enough. Vera was already in the driver's seat. The truck's keys were in the ignition. Delivery trucks in loading docks always had keys in the ignition, because the drivers who used them were more concerned with efficiency than security. And this small, mundane fact was the single most beautiful thing Vera had encountered in 3 years of planning. She'd driven trucks like this before her father's shipping yard, summers spent learning to reverse flatbeds into narrow loading bays while dock workers shouted directions in Pidgin. It was one of the few gifts her old life had left her that this new one could use. She turned the key. The engine roared. Diesel, loud, furious, the sound of a machine that was not designed for delicacy. She slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, and the delivery truck, a white, unmarked 12-ton vehicle carrying a syndicate boss, his battered brother, and a disgraced journalist holding a ledger that could topple a corporate empire, lurched forward through the open loading dock door and onto the service road. Behind them, gunfire cracked against the truck's rear panel. 2 shots. 3. The metallic ping of bullets hitting steel echoed through the cab like percussion. Min-jun ducked. In-ho braced himself against the dashboard, one hand on his brother's shoulder, the other gripping the door handle, his face lit by the passing streetlights in alternating bands of gold and shadow. Vera drove. She drove through the service road and onto the main boulevard. She drove past the palm trees and the street vendors packing up their stalls for the night. She drove past the harbor, where the water was black and silver and the lights of fishing boats dotted the surface like fallen stars. She drove until the Meridian Atlantic Tower was nothing but a column of light in the rearview mirror, shrinking, diminishing, becoming exactly what it had always been beneath the glass and marble, a monument to a man who believed he could own everything, including the truth. The sirens multiplied behind them. Police, fire services, the machinery of a city responding to the explosion of a secret it had been forced to swallow for too long. Vera pulled the truck into an alley behind a market that was closed for the night, killed the engine, sat in the silence, the real silence, the kind that comes after the noise stops and your body hasn't yet realized it's safe and breathed. In-ho looked at her across the dark cab. Minjun was between them, his head resting against his brother's shoulder, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow but steady. The boy had passed out. Exhaustion, dehydration, 5 weeks of terror finally catching up to a body that had been running on nothing but fear and the hope that his brother was coming. In-ho's face was streaked with concrete dust. His navy suit was destroyed. The white shirt was torn at the shoulder. Every carefully managed concealment stripped away, the ink on his neck and forearms fully exposed now, unhidden for the first time in public. His dark eyes found Vera's, and in them she saw something she hadn't seen before, not the composure, not the dominance, not the dark amusement of a man who enjoyed having the upper hand. Gratitude. Raw, unguarded, unperformed gratitude. The kind that could not be faked because it came from a place deeper than personality or strategy, from the place where a man's love for his brother lived, undiluted by everything he had become. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The silence between them held it perfectly, the way a cathedral holds a prayer not in the words, but in the architecture of the space around them. Vera pressed the black leather ledger against her chest and let herself breathe. The arrest happened 4 days later. Vera had made copies of the ledger digital scans, encrypted and distributed to 3 separate journalists she'd worked with before her career was destroyed, each of them given a different section with instructions to publish simultaneously. The distribution was deliberate, surgical, a dead man's switch of information designed so that even if Whitmore's lawyers silenced one outlet, the others would detonate. And they did. The first article broke online within 48 hours, and by the time Whitmore's legal team scrambled to file injunctions, the remaining sections had already been published across 3 different platforms in 3 different countries. Whitmore tried to run. A private charter to Dubai, booked under his wife's maiden name, intercepted on the tarmac by federal agents who had been reading the same articles as the rest of the world. The sky had closed above him before he ever left the ground. She kept the original, walked it into the offices of the National Anti-Corruption Commission herself, wearing the crimson-red blouse and the braided crown, her real name on her lips for the first time in 14 months. The investigator who received her was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses and the expression of someone who had seen too many things to be easily shocked. She was shocked. The ledger documented 17 years of systematic fraud, asset theft, human trafficking, and the bribery of officials at every level of the city's infrastructure. It named names, dates, amounts. The skeleton of a criminal empire laid bare in neat columns of handwritten numbers. Charles Whitmore was arrested at his residence on a Tuesday morning. The footage broadcast by every news outlet in the country showed him being led from his oceanfront mansion in handcuffs, his face carrying the bewildered, offended expression of a man who had genuinely believed he was untouchable. Behind him, forensic teams in white suits entered the building with the methodical patience of people who expected to be working for a long time. The Diemer name appeared in the news cycle 3 days later, not in scandal, not in whispered accusation, in vindication. The fraudulent acquisition of her father's shipping company was exposed in its entirety. The fabricated debts, the coerced board members, the deliberately triggered bankruptcy that had destroyed a legitimate business to feed Whitmore's logistics network. An editorial in the country's largest newspaper called the Diemer family casualties of corporate terrorism, and Vera read the words in her small apartment above the tailor shop, sitting on her bed with her knees drawn to her chest, and cried for the first time in 3 years. She cried for her father, who had died believing the world thought he was a criminal. She cried for her mother, who had given her a language as armor and never lived to see her daughter use it. She cried for the 14 months of silence, of smallness, of being furniture in a building that had been built on her family's bones. And when she was finished, she washed her face, braided her hair, and went to the market to buy groceries, because grief and groceries were not mutually exclusive, and survival had always been a series of ordinary acts performed in the shadow of extraordinary pain. Minjun was admitted to a private hospital on the outskirts of the city. The doctors said dehydration, malnutrition, psychological trauma, the clinical language of suffering that reduced 5 weeks of captivity to a list of conditions with treatment protocols. In-ho stayed at his brother's bedside for 72 hours straight. Sung-min handled the logistics, the safe house, the vehicle disposal, the quiet conversations with contacts in Seoul who could make certain records disappear, while Jae-won, whose cut eyebrow was now held together with butterfly bandages and whose loyalty was apparently transferable to anyone who had helped save his boss's brother, texted Vera updates on the burner phone she still hadn't thrown away. "He hasn't slept. He asked about you. He still hasn't slept." Min-jun woke up. "Asked for guitar." In-ho cried. "Don't tell him I told you." Vera read the messages at her kitchen table, in the yellow lamplight, in the silence of an apartment that felt larger now that the secret she'd been carrying had been set down. She didn't reply. She didn't know what to say. The mission was over. The ledger was delivered. The brother was saved. The CEO was in custody. Every thread that had bound her to Wang In-ho, the blackmail, the alliance, the shared grief, the voice in the walls had been cut. And what remained was the question neither of them had answered in the penthouse, in the corridor, in the dark cab of a delivery truck with a sleeping boy between them. What were they now? He came to her apartment on a Sunday. She knew it was him before she opened the door. Not because she heard his footsteps, though she did. That quiet, deliberate stride that she would have recognized in a crowd of thousands. Not because Jae-won had texted her a warning, though he had. A single message that read, "Coming to you, looks different, good, different." She knew because the air in the hallway changed the way it always changed when Wang In-ho entered a space, a subtle shift in pressure, in temperature, in the behavior of the molecules themselves, as if even the atmosphere understood that something significant had arrived. She opened the door. He stood on the landing in a white t-shirt and dark jeans. No suit, no performance. The tattoos were fully visible swallows and roses and geometric patterns, running from his knuckles to his neck, unhidden, unmanaged, presented to the world exactly as they were. The silver rings were back on his fingers. His dark hair was unstyled, falling across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, closer to human, further from the lethal, composed figure who had pinned her against a white pillar 5 weeks ago and whispered her world apart. He was holding a paper bag from the market downstairs. Inside it, Vera could see plantain chips, the brand her mother used to buy. The kind sold by the vendor 3 streets over who roasted them fresh every morning and wrapped them in brown paper with handwritten price tags. "How do you know what I eat?" she said. "I know everything about you," he said, not boasting, not threatening, stating a fact with the same quiet certainty he'd used when he told her he was not leaving this city without his brother. "I've known everything about you since the second day you walked into that building." Vera leaned against the doorframe, crossed her arms, felt the familiar defensive architecture lock into place the walls, the distance, the carefully calibrated expression that said, "I am unreachable, and I prefer it that way." But the architecture felt different now, thinner, more translucent, like holding up a sheet of paper and pretending it was a fortress. "Min-jun?" she asked. "Recovering. He asked me to bring you something," he said. In-ho paused. A flicker of something crossed his face. Amusement, tenderness, the particular exasperation of an older brother quoting a younger one. He said, "Tell the woman who yelled at you through the walls that she's invited for dinner when I can cook again. He's a terrible cook. I should warn you." Vera almost smiled, caught it, held it behind her teeth like a secret. "You could have sent Jae-won with the plantain chips," she said. "I could have. But you came yourself." "I came myself." The silence between them settled into the doorway like a third person. It was different from the silences they'd shared before, different from the strategic silence in the car, the operational silence in the penthouse, the loaded silence in the server room with gunfire on the monitors. This silence was clean, unhurried. The silence of 2 people standing in an ordinary doorway on an ordinary Sunday, in an ordinary neighborhood. And for the first time in the entire span of their knowing each other, neither of them was pretending to be someone else. In-ho looked at her, And the weight of his gaze, that same physical, inescapable intensity she'd felt the first time he'd assessed her across a sunlit corridor, was still there. But it had changed. It was no longer the look of a man disassembling a clock. It was the look of a man who had already seen every gear and spring and hidden mechanism, and had decided that the whole was more extraordinary than the sum of its parts. "I don't need an informant anymore," he said quietly. "The mission is done. The ledger is public. My brother is safe. Every reason I had to keep you close is gone." Vera's chest tightened. She didn't trust the tightness. Didn't trust the way her body had begun responding to his proximity like a compass responding to north, involuntary, magnetic, immune to the rational objections her mind kept filing. "Then why are you here?" she asked. In-ho set the paper bag on the floor between them, straightened, took a single step closer, not into her space, not past the threshold of her door, but close enough that she could see the individual feathers on the swallows inked across his forearm, close enough that the scent she had first encountered in a sunlit corridor, sandalwood, steel, something that smelled like the exact boundary between danger and devotion, reached her for the last time as a surprise, and the first time as a choice. "Because I don't want you close for the mission," he said. "I want you close because you are the most terrifying woman I have ever met, because you carried a fire extinguisher into a gunfight, because you guided me through the dark with your voice and I have not been able to stop hearing it since, because you held a ledger against your chest like it was a living thing, and I understood. I understood completely because I held my brother the same way." He paused. His jaw tightened. The tattoo on his neck shifted with the movement, the geometric lines rearranging themselves like a code being rewritten. "I'm not asking you to be my spy. I'm not asking you to be my ally. I'm asking you to be beside me. Not behind me. Not beneath me. Beside me." His voice dropped. Korean, now. The language they shared, the language her mother had given her and his country had given him. The language that had been their secret weapon and their private rebellion, and the thread that had stitched them together in a building, designed to keep everyone apart. "I'm asking you to be my queen." Vera stood in the doorway of her small apartment above the tailor shop. The Sunday afternoon light filtered through the hallway window behind him, catching the dust motes in the air, turning them to gold. From downstairs, the sound of the tailor's radio drifted up a song she half recognized. Something about coming home, something about finding the place where you were supposed to be. She looked at Wang In-ho, at the tattoos and the silver rings and the paper bag of plantain chips on the floor between them, at the man who had cornered her against a wall and whispered her disguise apart, who had blackmailed her and trusted her and covered her with a blanket while she slept, who had knelt on a vault floor and pressed his forehead to his brother's and broken in a way that only a person capable of enormous love could break, who was standing in her doorway now, undisguised, unarmored, asking. She reached down and picked up the paper bag. "Come inside," she said, "and don't ever call me good girl again." In-ho's mouth curved into that slow, dark, devastating smile, the one she had first seen in a sunlit corridor, the one that transformed his face from menacing to something she didn't yet have the vocabulary for, something she suspected she would spend a very long time learning to name. "No promises," he said, and he stepped through the door. If Vera and In-ho's story took your breath away, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell because more stories like this are coming. Comment below, Team Vera or Team In-ho? And tell me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our stories are going. She walked into that building as furniture. She walked out as a queen. See you in the next.